Good evening, everybody.
First of all, let me bring up our candidates very quickly to tell you the two candidates are the same two candidates who were on the April special election board to succeed Chris Zimmerman, who retired earlier in the year. We have independent incumbent John Vihstadt and Democrat Alan Howze, and if you'd like to come on up, please welcome them. We will go ahead with openings. Please welcome Alan Howze.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming out. I'd like to thank the Committee of 100 for hosting tonight's debate and Scott for moderating. I'll just start out by saying, we do have a great community here in Arlington, and I think we do owe the people in this room a debt of gratitude for having the courage to make bold choices and smart investments that gave us the community that we know today. It took vision, it took persistence, and it took leadership. It took moving beyond saying no and having the courage to take the long view and to move forward, even in the face of an unknown future. The voices of no have always been there, and they are still today. But just imagine, what would our community be if the no crowd had prevailed? Would we be more prosperous, less congested? Would we have a higher quality of life? With the benefit of hindsight, the answers are obvious, and today we know that the investments made over decades have been instrumental to our community's success. We should not turn away from the opportunity today to make similar choices that will secure a more prosperous future. I'm running because I believe I have a vision for Arlington and specific ideas to make our community better. This means we must address the challenges that we face, starting with our overcrowded schools and the largest kindergarten class in Arlington history that started this year. I would be the only member of the county board with children in our schools. We have a metro system nearing capacity, a shortage of housing that is affordable, and a regional economy dealing with federal cutbacks. I bring business experience and a strong voice for fiscal responsibility, just as I was on fiscal affairs, where I called for lower taxes, focused on maintaining parks and infrastructure. I was not afraid to ask hard questions and to push for better performance and lower cost. But fiscal responsibility means not only being good stewards of today's dollars, it means making wise investments in school and infrastructure. And today we face a set of generational decisions that will affect our community for decades to come. I'll bring new ideas, new solutions, and a sense of urgency to address the challenges that we face. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to your questions tonight.
Thank you, Alan. And now please welcome County Board Member John Vihstadt for his 2 minutes.
Thank you, Scott. Geez, I better be on my best behavior tonight with two of my colleagues here, Mary Hines and Jay Vihstadt. Thanks to the Committee of 100, and thank you for all being here tonight. This is actually my fourth time before you, going back to the 80s when I was a board member. Last spring, I decided to put my 30 years of community activism and engagement to work on the county board, and I asked for your vote as a candidate at that time. Now, as your newest county board member, I ask for your vote again on November 4th. Arlington voters really shook things up on April 8th. Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Independents all came together to endorse our independent drive for balance, accountability, and a fresh perspective in local government. I can't take sole credit for everything. My colleagues won't let me. But since I've been on the board, we've lowered the property tax rate for the first time in 9 years. We've freed up more bonding capacity to address our school's capacity crisis, and we've directed the county manager to study staffing levels for our fire and police. But there's a lot more to do. As I advocated during the campaign, we need still greater transparency and accountability in county government. We're hiring an internal auditor, we're implementing a fraud and abuse hotline, and employee whistleblower protection. And we've got to do a better job of communicating with communities earlier and in a truly transparent fashion on everything from citing fire stations to citing schools. And I'll continue to push for investments in core services like public schools, public safety, infrastructure maintenance, and neighborhood quality of life. Not slow and expensive streetcars, not more fancy bus stops, not a gold-plated aquatic center, or a $1.6 million dog park again. Arlington elected me to make a difference. We now have real discussions at 2100 Clarendon Boulevard. With your help, I'll continue to ask questions and not just nod my head. I approach every issue as I always have in a fair, nonpartisan manner. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great.
So this is for Mr. Vihstadt. Metro is clearly at the heart of the Arlington economy. The land above Metro is 10% of the land in Arlington, yet accounts for 50% of our tax revenue, which funds our schools and county services. At our most recent debate at Walter Reed Community Center, in explaining your opposition to the streetcar, you said that the high vacancy rate in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor was evidence that the rail transit is not linked to economic growth. Can you elaborate on why you think the rail and the RB corridor and economic growth are not linked?
Thank you. I wish we could roll the tape on that one. That isn't exactly what I said. What I said is that no transit, whether it's buses, streetcars, or metro, is a panacea for anything. You know, we've had this debate about, streetcar versus bus versus metro. The fact of the matter is, if metro were the panacea for our school system, for affordable housing, and so forth, we wouldn't have 30% vacancy rates in the metro corridors right now. The fact of the matter is that a streetcar is going to move in traffic without a dedicated lane along Columbia Pike. We can implement a modified form of bus rapid transit in both the Columbia Pike corridor and the Route 1 corridor at a fraction of the cost, much more quickly, with about the same quality of economic development, as much capacity, and with as good of comfort and with better regional connectivity than we can a streetcar. So, my view is that the metro system is extremely costly. It has served the Roslyn-Ballston corridor well in North Arlington. It's also served the blue line, the yellow line, the Route 1 corridor well in South Arlington. But the fact that the times have changed, circumstances have changed. It's going to be a cold day, and you know what, before we're going to get a metro system, another line anywhere in Virginia.
All right, thank you. Mr. Howze, you get a minute back.
Well, I think as the answer showed, and clearly, I think trying to distance the linkage between transportation and infrastructure and economic development is not the history of Arlington. That when we look at the investments that were made and the conversation that was had in our community 50 years ago, and more recently with the Silver Line, when the alternative proposals in both cases were buses down Wilson Boulevard and subsequently buses to Tyson's, that we have seen that rail transit has driven the kind of economic growth and sustainability and success for our community. It has given us literally billions of dollars in economic growth, thousands of jobs, and in a way that has preserved both the single-family neighborhoods as well as giving us the resources to be able to have some of the best schools in the entire nation. And that is the course that we should continue, and we should be looking at those future investments, the streetcar and in metro, that will give us the economy that we need for the next 10 years, the next 20 years, the next 40 years.
Okay, you can take a breath, but just a quick breath, because now is the question from Mr. Vihstadt to Mr. Howze. Similar theme. Alan, it starts. That's not me, that's Mr. Vihstadt. Alan, you often equate the streetcar with metro. How can you do that? Metro doesn't mix with traffic. It's speedy. The streetcar is slow, above ground, mixed with traffic, and can't go any faster than what's in front of it on Columbia Pike. It will be stuck if there is anything on the track in front of it, like an ambulance on a run or a stalled car. Other than that they run on expensive rail, how are they the same, or even similar?
Sure. Well, let's just roll that question back a little bit and say, okay, what are the options for both for transportation in those corridors? And we're talking about Fairfax, Columbia Pike, Pentagon City, Crystal City. How do we both drive transportation solutions in those corridors and also the economic growth that we want to have in a revitalized Crystal City and a renewed Columbia Pike corridor? And you start with, okay, what about metro? Could we put a metro line under Columbia Pike? And the short answer, for a couple of reasons, is no, it doesn't make sense. One is because the neighborhood, when they went through the neighborhood planning process over a course of a decade and more, decided that they didn't want the density of a Roslyn-Ballston corridor. So that doesn't support the undergrounding of a metro line through there at the cost of billions of dollars. The other problem is that billions of dollars doesn't exist. The only way we got an extension of the Silver Line and the first addition in regional transit in decades was through the revenue bonds off of the toll road. So clearly, you sort of strike metro off the list of options, and now you're left with, can we add more buses, or can we go with a streetcar option, and which is a modified form of light rail. And for me, when I looked at this, and I approached it as from a point of skepticism on my service on fiscal affairs, and from my business experience is what makes the most sense, what both drives the most return on investment, but also what is the right choice in terms of transportation. So streetcars have higher carrying capacity. You're moving at 6-minute headwinds, head times in terms of the transit through the corridor, so you're carrying more people through there. And just like today, if you go down Columbia Pike and you drive the corridor in the morning, you'll see that there are lots of buses down there. It's the most heavily trafficked bus corridor in the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. So what happens if a bus pulls up to a stop? Well, cars go around it, just like they do today, just like they would with a streetcar. Now in Pentagon City and Crystal City, where we control more of the roadway and there's space available, it would be running in its own dedicated lane. So we shouldn't let the perfect, in this case, be the enemy of the good in what will be a very good solution that will drive economic growth, reduce congestion, and reduce our carbon emissions.
There we go. Mr. Vihstadt, 1 minute.
Thanks, Scott. I'd ask you to think about three components when we talk about metro versus streetcar and what we've heard before and what we're hearing again tonight. Think about these three things. Number one, metro has its own dedicated lane underground. It's not going to go in mixed traffic as a streetcar will along Columbia Pike. Number two, metro binds two states, Maryland and Virginia, and the District of Columbia together in a metropolitan-wide system of over 100 track miles. The streetcar is going to go start a little bit in Skyline City, and let's hope that by the time people pile into it at Skyline City and it gets to the Arlington border, that there will be the seats for Arlingtonians there. And then the other item is that you voted on Metro back in the late 1960s. You're not being allowed to vote on the streetcar now. Those three things, regional connectivity, a dedicated lane, and a vote, are never going to be true of the streetcar like they were for Metro.
Okay,
think about that.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to your question. Let's start with this one. Let me just pull this up. In the Sun Gazette's recent endorsement of this year's bond referendums, the papers are right there if you need them, it discussed upcoming fiscal pressures and noted that free money does not exist with regard to bonds. So going forward, what kind of spending trade-offs are you willing to take? And so we will go with John Vihstadt for that.
On November's ballot, there are four bonds. There's a $106 million school bond, a $60 million Metro bond, a $13 million Parks and Recreation bond, and a $40 million infrastructure bond. I support all four of those bonds. Those bonds are strategic investments in our future. Now, one of the things that you might hear from my opponent is that, well, I voted against schools and Metro and so forth to prove a point about the streetcar. Libby Garvey and I did vote against the Capital Improvement Plan, the CIP, this year. The CIP, keep in mind, is a 10-year blueprint, and the way that most of those projects are funded in the CIP is through bonds. Libby and I made a motion to strip out the streetcar from the CIP. The percentage of the streetcar in this year's CIP, almost 20% of our CIP dollars for one project, a $7.5 million streetcar. We lost. So we felt that we had an obligation to vote against the CIP and not saddle folks with an albatross that makes no operational and economic sense for decades to come. But the fact of the matter is that I support all four bonds. I made sure that the Metro bond does not include any money for the streetcar, that the Parks and Recreation bond does not include any more money for the Long Bridge Aquatic Center. We need to make sound strategic investments for our future and not concentrate our funding on wasteful projects that do not serve our modern needs.
Mr. Howze?
I think this is a great question, and I'll answer it by saying this, that we need to put schools first, that needs to be the first priority, and it has been repeatedly supported by our community. So what does that mean? It means that we've got a rapidly growing school population. We've, as I mentioned at the onset, the largest kindergarten class in Arlington's history. We are on path to surpass the highest numbers ever in Arlington school enrollment back in the baby boom. So we've got a real challenge on our hands, and it's going to require a significant amount of community resources to meet that challenge. My kids, for the 5th year in a row, go on a bus to a school that is 130% capacity, and it's only getting worse. So this is something we need to address now, and we need to also put into place a plan for the next 10 years of how we're going to meet this capacity. And it is going to require bonds. It's also going to require that we look carefully and take hard looks at the $1.2 billion in operating budget that we have. Because you don't have to move the needle very far on $1.2 billion to free up funds that can be used for schools and for construction and operating costs. And so on fiscal affairs and in my professional life, what I've done is look very carefully at county spending as well as government spending in general and look for ways that we can drive and use innovation to drive better services, to reduce costs, and to think about how do we use performance management. How do we give specific targets to say, okay, we're going to deliver this service for less next year, and this is how we're going to do it. So I think that's the kind of approach that I take to it, both in terms of meeting our needs for now as well as thinking about how we're going to meet them in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. This one is directed to Mr. Howze, so you will go next, and then Mr. Vihstadt. There's talk of reviving the Longbridge Aquatic Center by coupling it with Washington's 2024 Olympic bid. What do you think of this proposal?
So I'll say that that I chaired the bond campaign in 2012, and the voters passed overwhelmingly the Parks bond that supported the Aquatic Center. I think, though, that certainly times have changed in a couple of different ways. One is that the emergence, more rapid emergence, I would say, of the school's need, and I think, again, we need to put those school priorities first. And then second is that I think the costs got away from the project, and it was clear that I think the manager made the right call in pulling back from it, and it has been put on indefinite hold now, and I think that's the right decision until the costs can come back in line with what has been approved by voters, and then to take a look at it and match it up against other community needs. Now, it's clear that the demand is there in the community for more aquatic facilities. The wait times and classes have more than doubled in the last 3 years, and again, it's connected up both with the rising school population. Those kids don't just go to school. They need swim lessons. They use our facilities in all kinds of ways in parks and recreation, but also an active adult population and a growing senior population that is a heavy user of our aquatic facilities. And so you don't have to go to the high school pools on pretty much any given day to see that there's a tremendous demand in the community. So how we meet that demand is, I think, the question before us, and that is something that has been attempted once, and I think unsuccessfully. Now we need to go back and take another look at it. I think the other part of the question was around the Olympic bid, and now I'll say that I approach this with a healthy degree of skepticism. Let's just say that, and in terms of I think some of the experiences around the Olympic bids more generally in the last decade or two should give us some pause. And so, there's a long time between now and 2024 and any sort of decision. So, that would have to be looked at, but it's something we would want to approach very carefully.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vihstadt.
Thank you. I applauded the county manager when she put the aquatic center on hold back in January after repeated stories of skyrocketing construction costs, and not just skyrocketing construction costs, but higher and higher operating costs, which were first projected at $400,000 or $500,000 a year, and finally mushroomed to almost $4 million a year before the story was all over. I do believe we need community pools. We have 3 fairly new community pools at our 3 high schools. That may not be adequate. We also have some private swim clubs. But I would like to see that money reprogrammed, if possible, and it may not be. The lawyers tell us there's certain things we can and cannot do, into community pools. I'd like to see the aquatic center scaled back to a more utilitarian and affordable fashion. But let me go back to a point about the bond. People like to say, well, the voters approved it in the 2004 bond. The aquatic center was in the 2004 bond. Then there had to be more money added in the 2012 bond, and then they had to take $15 million through a transfer of development rights scheme from Crystal City to inject more money into it, and it still wasn't enough. one of the concerns that I have about the bonds that we vote for is that the bonds are not transparent enough. They don't give enough detail. And I think that particularly large projects like the Aquatic Center ought to be spelled out in the bond to say, okay, this is how much of this bond we project at this time to build this particular project, rather than having it all wrapped in to the same pot. Our construction cost projections, we, the county, even hired an independent architect, and the numbers were still wrong. As far as the Olympics are concerned, I think we need to give priority to more seats for more students rather than more seats for international sports enthusiasts.
Okay, thank you. Now this one is a two-parter with a little bit in the middle of it, a multiple choice. So thank you for whoever did this. Regarding the pace of high-rise office development, do you think the current pace and the current heights of the buildings is about right, too much, too high, or too slow, too short? And, this is the zinger, what about Vornado being too big to say no to? How do you feel about that? So I think we'll start with Mr. Vihstadt.
Thank you. Boy, you know, when I was sworn into the county board on I got elected on April 8th, and I was sworn in on April 11th, and, you know, it's been a whirlwind ever since, meeting with so many people, and, you know, everybody wants your attention and so forth. So I actually did have a meeting with Vornado, and I accepted a tote bag, and now I'm having second thoughts about whether I should have done that. But, you know, as far as commercial development in general is concerned, I think, frankly, that we need to take a deep breath and step back and think about where we're going as a community with development. Because the more development we have, and don't get me wrong, we need development, we need to keep our residential property tax rate down, but I think it's also important to remember that the more development that we have, the greater stress is imposed on our schools, our parks, our infrastructure, and our public safety. And it's all about finding that right balance. How much development is too much, and where is that development going to be? I think we all agree that transit-oriented development is a good thing. We need to concentrate that development in our Roslyn, Ballston, and Crystal City corridors, but there are a growing number of neighborhoods that are apprehensive about edge development and about development creeping into their neighborhoods. There's some people in Bluemont right now who are already jokingly referring to their neighborhood as West Ballston. I don't think that's right. I think we need to protect the integrity of our single-family neighborhoods. We need to look at our approach to edge development, and we have to fully take in the ramifications of development and what it's doing to our parks, our public schools, our infrastructure, our public safety staffing levels, and all the other ripple effects that development has. Now there's, you know, how high is too high? That's going to be a variable thing. Certainly higher in Roslyn it makes more sense than higher, say, in Clarendon. But we need to have that conversation.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Howze?
So I'll just start with a little story, which is that some of you may know I was born in Arlington Hospital. I grew up in Clarendon on Jackson Street, across from Clarendon Presbyterian Church, in a little farmhouse. And some of my earliest memories was helping my dad dig out the basement and finding in that basement an old well from way back, filled with milk bottles from what had been a dairy farm, and the medicinal pill bottles. And the reason I say that story is that, you know, that house, by the way, is no longer there. There are two houses from the block that I grew up on that are still there. And over the last 40 years that I've been around, our community has changed. And I can also remember, and Charlie Clark helps to bring this to mind as well, is all the changes that have taken place in our community literally for decades, for hundreds of years. So our community is constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, and I think the question is, what is the balance point, right? What is the right mix of commercial development, of economic development, of protecting our neighborhoods? And this is a conversation that is ongoing. It happens in the Planning Commission and the board and in neighborhoods almost on a monthly basis. And as president of my civic association, I saw that too with the East Falls Church plan that was under discussion. So again, this is not a new conversation for Arlington. And I think what the question is, can we balance in the community plan that we've got the needs of multiple sets of stakeholders, right? because it's not just residents in single-family neighborhoods where I, I live and love it for lots of reasons. It's also we've got tens of thousands of residents who live in Crystal City and who live along the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. What are their needs, and what are we doing as a community to make sure that we're meeting all the needs of all the folks here? And and I think that's the question that we should be continually asking and finding that right balance point.
And we will be continually asking, because the very next question is, what measures do you propose? So let's be specific, gentlemen. I'll jump in if you're not being specific. What measures do you propose to mitigate the present stresses on single-family neighborhoods impacted by excessive noise, traffic congestion, and air quality? So what can be done, and what will you do? And Mr. Howze, that's for you.
Maybe I'll take it in reverse order. Start with the air quality. So I got into politics through environmental activism, and it's something that I care very deeply about. And I think we've made some strides in our community actually in the last decade. The closing of the Miriant power plant in Alexandria has certainly significantly contributed to our air quality. The hybrid fleets now that are on our roads now have significantly decreased our emissions as well. Arlington's got the lowest carbon footprint of any community in Virginia. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. One, the main reason is that we've got great transit, right? And so that is the prime driver for and way that a lot of people move about our community. So if we're thinking about air quality, one of the best ways that we can improve the air quality and reduce our carbon emissions is to enhance transit, to provide more transit. And for me, that's an important part of why the streetcar is so important for our community. It's also why the Sierra Club supports it. It's why the Sierra Club has endorsed me in this campaign, because they understand the linkage between good quality transit, giving people choices that they're going to use, and better environmental protection and air quality. So let me start with that point. Switch back to the other side of it, which was in the single-family neighborhood. So again, that's the sort of neighborhood I live in. I live in an old 1940s, story and a half, and all around, you see houses that are getting torn down and very large ones that are coming up in its place. So this is something that has been of concern and on the minds of my neighbors and a lot of other folks for a long time, because not only does it affect the character and the visual aspect of the neighborhoods, but it also affects the affordability of our neighborhoods. So I do think we need to be thinking about that, and some specifics could be around the height of the buildings, which was changed more recently, and thinking about how does that affect the scale and scope of the building. So I think we should be thinking about the tools that are available to us, lot coverage being another one, and maybe it is time to look at some of those tools and how that affects our single-family neighborhoods, which is also, by the way, those turnover in those single-family neighborhoods is what is driving our tremendous growth in school enrollment.
Thank you. Mr. Vihstadt.
Thank you, Scott. Three things. First, with respect to noise, I'm happy to say that the county board, with my full approval and a unanimous 5-0 vote earlier this spring, we did legislate a noise ordinance for Arlington County that puts new controls in many areas of the county, depending on the hours, how loud noise can be, depending on the source of the noise, the volume of the noise, that type of thing. We exempted church bells, thank goodness. And we exempted the clock tower at Westover, where I live. I live in Terraleeway Heights at 18th and Jefferson Street. Another thing we did with respect to noise, and kind of a neighborhood quality of life type of thing, is we voted to amend our special events policy to get a grip on these pub crawls, which right now are limited for the most part to Clarendon, although somebody said to me the other day, I'll know that Roslyn has finally arrived when we can have a pub crawl in Roslyn. But these pub crawls, we were incurring a lot of overtime expenses, and we had to appropriate $40,000 in the last budget to pay for police overtime that were precipitated by these pub crawls. Now we have legislation which will impose basically a net neutral cost from the county's perspective, so that the bar promoters and the bar owners are going to have to pay up to pay for the overtime that is going to be occasioned by police presence, sanitation, littering, and that type of thing. With respect to traffic, one of the best things about serving on the county board is really getting into the granular nitty-gritty and meeting with so many neighborhoods. I've met with folks in Douglas Park about bike boulevards, with folks in Bluemont about Wilson Boulevard. We're trying to implement a complete streets program in this county, multimodal, where everybody will feel welcome on our streets, cyclists, pedestrians, drivers, and so forth. That takes a lot of work. But of course, the more development we have, possibly the more traffic we're going to have. But we absolutely need smart transit. But once again, I come back to the streetcar. The streetcar is not going to be an environmental panacea. Buses run on clean natural gas. Streetcars are going to have be on the electric grid.
There we go. You'll notice, as moderator, what I'm doing is allowing the candidates to finish at a period, and it's amazing how politicians can use commas and semicolons, M dashes. So anyway, Mr. Vihstadt, you get this one first, and there's a reason for that. Here's the question. In Mr. Vihstadt's short time on the county board, he has voted against schools, safety, parks, economic development, water, sewer, street paving, and bridge renovations. Why shouldn't we think of Mr. Vihstadt as Mr. Obstruction? And I do want to say, Jay Fazette, that was a rude question. That really was not, you know. But Mr. Vihstadt, you take it and turn it around. You can win the crowd over with this one. Why shouldn't we think of you as Mr. Obstruction?
Well, you know, I guess the first thing I would say to that is, you know, I think that we probably need at least one voice down at 2100 Clarendon Boulevard to maybe say no to a few things on occasion, or at least question a few things. Now, the items that were rattled off in your question, or whose ever question it was, Scott, as I indicated in my answer to another question, I mean, Libby and I voted against the CIP once again because we felt that fully 20% of the CIP, we didn't feel comfortable voting for a CIP that had fully 20% of the budget over 10 years earmarked to a $500 million streetcar along Columbia Pike and Route 1. But the fact of the matter is that the CIP is only a fiscal blueprint going out 10 years. Projects get pulled back from the CIP, they move forward, they get taken out, they get put in. The way that most of these projects are funded are through bonds. I not only voted to support, but I have heartily endorsed all 4 bonds: the school bond, the Parks and Rec bond, the infrastructure bond, and the transportation and metro bond.
Mr. Howze?
So I'll say that I think the question really is about how do we meet the future needs of our community? And that's really what the CIP is focused on. And my service on the Fiscal Affairs Commission had an opportunity to weigh in on a couple of CIPs and to think about, you know, what is the trade-offs? How do we secure the future and a more prosperous future for our community? And those are investments in schools, in transportation, in parks and recreation. And I'll say that, you know, I think diversity comes in many forms. And, you know, right now, we don't have anybody on the county board who's got kids in our schools. I do. I've got 3 kids, 9, 6, and 3. So let me tell you, I'm very, very focused on making sure that the county board and the school board are working together in not only the CIP and the capital side, but the operating side as well, to address this significant challenge for our community of how we're going to meet rising school enrollments. And you say, well, I don't have kids in schools. I maybe not have had kids in schools for many, many years, but it affects all of us because half of the tax revenue in the county goes towards our school system, half of it. It's far and away the largest expenditure in our county, and it reflects the value and the investment that Arlington is willing to make in having great schools, because it improves the quality of our community and it improves the value of our community. So that is what we're talking about when we're talking about what is the capital plan and what does it mean. It's a reflection of the priorities and the values of our community. And I can tell you that I would not vote against providing more funding for the schools, for providing more classrooms for our children, because again, you know, I'm sending my kids to overcrowded schools every day, as are people across Arlington. It's not a North Arlington challenge or a South Arlington challenge. It's an all Arlington challenge, because we're seeing this enrollment growth everywhere.
Once again, Libby and I made a motion. It went down. It failed by a 2 yes, 3 no vote. We both stated that we would have voted for that CIP had it not been for the fact that 20% of it was comprised of the streetcar. And I want to reiterate, I fully supported all bonds. Let me say something else about the schools. I put 2 boys, my wife and I, Mary's here. Mary, take a bow, raise your hand. We put two boys through Arlington Public Schools, Tuckahoe, Swanson, and Yorktown over 17 years. That gives me a very broad historical perspective on what the needs of our schools are. I was president of the Yorktown PTA. I co-chaired the school bond all the way back in 2002. I won the school board's Honored Citizen Award along with a number of other citizens in 2008. What I think we need to do for our schools is we need a certain revenue sharing agreement. We need to free up additional bonding authority in future years, and we need to forge stronger ties with our school board. Thank you.
Real quickly, and then we're going to get to some streetcar, I promise you. Jay Vihstadt was on the county board, Mary Hines was on the county board in 2008. What was the biggest hot button issue in 2008? I looked it up today on an unrelated thing. Accessory dwelling units was the biggest issue of 2008. So here's a question, and those for you who don't know what they are internal, inside the houses, units that can be used for housing for individuals, one or two individuals. So in order to replace lost affordable housing units, what are your views on allowing more accessory dwelling units in Arlington?
The county has sort of stuck its toe into the ADU or accessory dwelling unit waters a couple of years ago, and I think wisely so in terms of taking it slow to think about what is the effect, what is the impact on our neighborhoods and our communities. And from what I've seen, and I can't say that I've spent a lot of time focused on this issue, that in fact it has not had the detrimental impacts that some might fear that it might. So I think it is something that we should be thinking about possibly around, is it one of the tools in the toolbox to address the challenge around affordable housing? And I say it's really around community affordability, right? Is how can people afford to stay in Arlington? Because that issue is one that affects people, not just low income workers in Arlington, but really up and down the economic spectrum. So when we're talking about accessory dwelling units, we could also be talking about seniors who are moving in to live with children. Or who choose to live in an accessory dwelling unit and rent out their house for additional income. So there are lots of sort of permutations of how this could look and how it could be done in ways that would protect the neighborhoods and also think about what are the issues around it, around parking and around street traffic and some of the other issues and concerns that have come up in the past when we're talking about this issue. But again, the bigger challenge is how do we make our community more affordable? And there are lots of tools, I think, in terms of additional funding for AHIF and thinking about how do we pull more of our private sector partners and nonprofits in the faith community into the challenge of providing more units that are accessible and affordable for a broad range of folks in our community, from those who are most at need and need permanent supportive housing with wraparound services, to lower income service workers, to workforce housing for teachers and police and firefighters who are starting out and who are having a challenge living in Arlington and the place they work because of the challenges around affordability.
Okay, Mr. Vihstadt.
I don't know that we disagree too terribly much on this issue. Accessory dwelling units were very, if you go back down memory lane, were a little contentious back at the time because there was I think some fear on the part of a lot of people that this would open the door towards people renting out their basement or the suite above the garage, or having an addition out back, and bringing a lot more people into the neighborhood, having people who had kids, people who had cars, just kind of the burden on infrastructure, the burden on schools, and so forth. And the counties, after hearing all of this testimony and all this concern from so many people, actually enacted a fairly restrictive ordinance in terms of the shape, the size, the height, and other building parameters for that accessory dwelling, such that I was at the Civic Federation Tuesday night when we had a presentation by county staff on the new affordable housing study. And by the way, that's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of that. I think we're all looking forward to that and hearing some ideas as to how we can continue to improve, or at least not lose so much affordable housing in our community. But it's only been a handful of occasions where people have taken advantage of that accessory dwelling protocol. So maybe we need to take a look at that, maybe liberalize it a little bit to see if we can't do that while still taking into consideration the needs and wants of folks in the single-family neighborhoods. With respect to affordable housing in general, let me just say that I think we need to look at how we can do this less expensively and more quickly through expedited processing, reduced fees perhaps, and maybe rethinking certain development requirements that don't compromise the project and that will be sensitive to the neighborhood. Maybe look at My time is up.
Let's dip our toe in the last few minutes we have left back into the whole Columbia Pike issue. This is for John Vihstadt, so you can start. John, person must know you. John, I read in the Sun Gazette, and that would be advertising department before I go further on this, all right? I read in the Sun Gazette advertising that the streetcar project would result in the demolition of 1,900 affordable housing units. Is this true? Not one question mark, not two question marks, but three question marks. Is this true?
The answer to so many questions is it depends. And seriously, it does depend, because if you look at the Pike Neighborhoods Plan, which I actually have an excerpt of in all my little briefing papers here, because I'm so concerned that there's something in here that I know that I can't remember right off the top of my head. But the Pike Neighborhood Plan does show schematic drawings in it that basically X out a very large number of current affordable projects along the Columbia Pike corridor. Now, why is that? Because one of the components of that plan is to have much higher density along the pike. So the way you get that higher density is you tear down units and replace them with much taller buildings. Now, in my view, we ought to be giving top priority to preserving our affordable housing, the affordable housing that already exists, places like Fillmore Gardens, Lee Gardens, and so forth, Westmont Gardens, that already fit within the scale of the neighborhood, that have a human scale, that aren't going to tower over single-family houses and that aren't going to tower over neighborhoods in general. That's where I would like to put our top priority, rather than super new high-rise projects that frankly are probably going to have fewer affordable units, and which affordable units are going to be more expensive. So it really kind of all depends on the metamorphosis of the Pike Neighborhoods Plan as to whether the tearing down of those units comes into reality. If an owner decides to take advantage of these incentives that we're offering for increased density, is he going to tear those down and build up, or is he going to let the status quo rule the day? I think the jury is still out on it, but my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Howze, you got it. Okay, thank you.
So if I heard that right, I think the approach is for protecting affordable housing along Columbia Pike is to hope and pray, but I don't think that's the right strategy, because that is not going to protect affordable housing in Arlington. We've seen that with Arna Valley. We've seen that with lots of other areas in our community that have fallen under to developers and have been redeveloped for and outside of the price range of many people in our community, and we see that reflected in lots of different ways. So how do we do it better? And this is where I think the Columbia Pike Plan is really a shining example of how we can get it right. So, as I said, I grew up in Clarendon. My parents bought a house a block and a half from Clarendon Metro for $20,000 in the early 70s when Metro was being built, right? Nobody thought at that time it would have the kind of quality of life impacts and would drive the sort of price appreciation that we've seen in the region. And so that has been just a tremendous phenomenon, because people want to be close to transit. They want to be close to where they work and to have access to be able to get from their home to their jobs. Those matter to people, and people are willing to pay who have the means for it. So we learned from the Orange Line and the Blue Line experience the downside effects of adding additional transit. So when it came to the Columbia Pike and Crystal City plan, Columbia Pike plan, there are three legs to it. One is the sector planning, governing how much development and the density. Number two is the streetcar, to provide the transportation asset to move people effectively through that corridor. And number three is the affordable housing plan, which protects 6,000 plus units of affordable housing along Columbia Pike for a no net loss of affordable housing. And the way it does that is by planning ahead and by using the return on the investment from the Columbia Pike redevelopment corridor to protect and preserve that affordable housing. That's the simplicity of the plan and the beauty of the plan. And if we don't do anything, if we use the disinvestment and hope strategy, you can be sure that in a decade or two that those units will no longer be there and we'll have a different Arlington.
A quick rejoinder, it's not just transit that governs development and redevelopment. So many other components go into what happens along a particular corridor. Look at Shirlington, okay? No metro, no streetcar, but a very good bus system. A number of components have already started to revitalize the Pike. Now you can say, well, it's been done in anticipation of the streetcar, but the fact of the matter is that zoning incentives, tax incentives, we have tech zones along the Pike and in the RB corridor and in Shirlington, land use decisions, streetscape improvements, a whole range of other real estate oriented devices can be used to prompt development and redevelopment. In addition to transit. Transit is absolutely a component, but it is not the only component. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to say I'm going to do 2 more questions. If there were no proposed streetcar on Columbia Pike, would anyone have proposed a bus rapid transit system at all?
So I'll say that, bus rapid transit has its place, and I'm not anti-bus rapid transit. I think, for example, the Route 50 corridor, where you've got enough space in that corridor, might be a very good option there. But I think in this case, and as we've seen in other cases, not only in Arlington, we see it in the Silver Line, and we've seen it, you can look around the nation, there's other examples where the BRT really becomes the no transit option. If you don't want the transit, then you say, well, let's do BRT instead. And that's really what it has become, I think, in this case, because you look at the Columbia Pike corridor, there is no lane for buses or for streetcars. So you can't have a dedicated lane for buses. You can't have bus rapid transit in the sense that buses are running down their own corridor like you do in other places, which is the definition of bus rapid transit. So you can add more buses to the corridor, but you run out of space there. That's the challenge. So it's not just meeting the needs of today, it's meeting the needs of 10 and 20 and 30 years down the road. So let me just put it in some context. So the funding is now secured for the project, with about, on a Columbia Pike portion, the state picking up half the cost, regional transportation dollars picking up a quarter of the remaining cost, and the last quarter being commercial surtax of businesses along Columbia Pike and Crystal City that have been paying into a fund for a couple of years now to accrue a balance to pay for the capital and the operating costs of the streetcar. All right? So the funding is now secured. So we can either take roughly $50 million in local share of dollars, and we can either get we can buy more buses with it, or we can get a much higher quality streetcar system that will drive not $1 billion in economic growth as proposed by the buses, but actually $3 or $4 billion in economic growth as proposed by the streetcar. And with that growth comes thousands of jobs, again, concentrated along the corridor and the way that we've grown along our Roslyn, Ballston, and Blue Line corridors that protects the single-family neighborhoods and helps us to pay for the rising costs of school enrollment, because the biggest budget driver in our community right now is the rising cost of school enrollment. And with all these kids coming into the schools, we're going to have to find a way to pay for it. And there's only a couple of options there. I think we should find a way to grow ourselves and grow our economy to help to pay for that.
Thank you. And Mr. Vihstadt, one last.
Speaking of growing, I'd really like to know if this streetcar can grow hair on my head. We just I want to respond to a couple things on this. We're told that state funding for the streetcar is secure. If you look at Secretary Lane, the Secretary of the State Transportation Department's July 10th letter to the county, we've heard that we're guaranteed $65 million. If you look at the Lane letter, it says, quote, "It is anticipated that up to $65 million may be available. Based on the county's preliminary cost estimates, the project may be eligible to receive up to 30% in matching funds under the current formula. The actual amount and timing of these funds will be subject to further refinement as we progress." So, this has more caveats and carve-outs than a winning sweepstakes letter, in my view. In terms of the efficacy of a streetcar versus bus rapid transit, first of all, I would point out that the administration itself in Washington, D.C., across the river, the FTA, their protocols for BRT do not specify that a streetcar or that a bus rapid transit has to be in a dedicated lane. And in fact, the lack of a dedicated lane is much more problematic for a streetcar than it is bus rapid transit. I'd also, a lot of you probably read The Economist. It's a great magazine. Let me just make a couple quotes for you if you don't believe me. "The relationship between streetcars and development is not clear," say researchers funded by the Federal Transit Administration. All this investment might make more sense if streetcars offered an efficient way to move people around, but here too the evidence is flimsy. A bus route could move up to 5 times more people an hour. And this from the University of California, Berkeley, which I know some people here probably put a great amount of stock in. America's streetcar revival is gobbling up funds that might otherwise go towards cheaper, nimbler forms of public transport, such as bus rapid transit. The economics of many light rail and streetcar projects is abysmal.
Okay. What? You want to rebuttal? Okay, Mr. Howze is going to rebut this one.
Right. Because what you hear is all about casting doubt. It's all about little seeds here and little seeds there about why it can't be done, why it's easier to say no than it is to say yes. And that is exactly the same approach that was taken 50 years ago on the Metro conversation. It's exactly the same approach that was taken to try and derail the Silver Line, because it's the same approach the anti-transit folks have used for decades, not only in our community, but in communities around the country to try and derail transit projects. It's just, you can ask the secretary about the efficacy of the funds and whether they're going to be there. They are going to be there, and now the funding is secured for it. And I'll say that, one, The Economist was an op-ed piece, perhaps paid for by a BRT lobbyist. We'll see. Those are going around. And groups that are opposed to transit, guess what? They're funded by the road builders. So, there's a don't believe everything you read, because there is a broader conversation about how do we move our community forward, how do we provide the economic development and the transportation needs, not only now, but for years down the future.
If you win in November, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I think, Mr. Vihstadt, this one starts with you.
5 years. I guess I would like to think that I'm in my first year of a second full term. I'm staying put, folks. I love being on the county board. It's a great opportunity to serve. I've moved to Arlington. I got off the covered wagon from Nebraska in 1980, settled in the district for a few months, moved to Arlington in 1981, settled down, met Mary. We got married in 1987. And we've been here now since 1981. I love Arlington. This is not a political stepping stone for me. I want to continue to serve our great county and make it even better as long as possible.
Okay, Mr. Howze.
So I'll say that in 5 years, where I see myself is as the father of a 9th grader, a 6th grader, and a 3rd grader. And I am very hopeful that by then we will have a broad plan with a community consensus about how we're going to meet the needs of our schools, because that is the #1 priority and the #1 challenge for our community. And I am committed to working with colleagues on the board and school board colleagues to make that happen, because we can't just have a series of one-off conversations that we're having now. We need to have a broader community conversation, which I called for back in the summer, to bring parties together from schools, from the parks community, from affordable housing, from infrastructure, to look at these needs in totality so that we can make the right decisions, the generational decisions that will affect our community for decades to come about where we're going to put schools, how we're going to meet this need, and how we're going to provide for a sustainable community in the broadest sense of the word, sustainable, for literally for years to come. So, I'm from Arlington. I've lived now in Lyon Village. I've lived in Fairlington. We're raising our own family just outside of Westover. We love Arlington, and we've made the choice to make this our home because of many of the same qualities that drove you all to call Arlington your home. Again, great public schools, access to transportation and transit assets, great parks. We're heavy users of the community's parks and recreational facilities. All those things are public investments that have made our community what it is today. And that is the kind of approach that I would bring to the county board, so that for the next generation, for my children, and really for their children, that we have an Arlington that is even better tomorrow than it is today. And that's what I want to do. That's why I'm running.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we go to closing statements, I would like you all to give yourselves a round of applause for the questions, which were the best I've heard during debate season. And I've heard a lot during debate season. So if I am correct on this, it is Mr. Vihstadt who's going to go first with the 2-minute closing statement.
Thank you, Scott. As far as that question that was just asked a second ago about, who's funding the push for bus rapid transit. I guess I would turn that around and say, who's funding the push for the streetcar? Maybe the streetcar industry? Maybe developers? Last April, Arlington voters had a real choice at the polls. 2 major candidates, 2 futures. Option 1, business as usual. Option 2, a little balance, another voice. On April 8th, the papers read, Independent breaks monopoly and Vihstadt promises vigilance and oversight. That's happening. Our message of accountability, transparency, core services, neighborhood quality of life continues to resonate. I promised to ask tough questions, and I am. Like, we asked developers for contributions for everything but public schools. Why not? What other transit projects are being compromised or nixed altogether because of the streetcar? The county won't tell us. How can we do a better job of engaging neighborhoods earlier on everything from sidewalks to siding of public facilities? Asking questions and raising issues is not divisive. Lively debate and the exchange of ideas is not wrong. It's responsible government, and in my view, it's essential that Arlington reaches its full potential for everyone. Arlington is at a crossroads. Yes, we must invest in our communities for the long haul, but our resources are not unlimited. There are trade-offs, and there are costs. Extravagant projects out of step with the times are not the measures of a community's success. Strong schools, public safety, sound infrastructure, a secure social safety net, and neighborhood quality of life are. For over 30 years, on boards and commissions, planning, housing, aging, in our neighborhoods and schools, I've worked to build bridges. I need your vote to ask questions and raise important issues to help ensure that we continue to have the debate and the discussion so critical to our collective future, now and after November 4th. Your vote counts. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you very much. And finishing up, Mr. Howze with his 2-minute finish.
Well, thanks again, Scott. Great job, as always. And I think, as you have heard tonight, that our community does stand at a crossroads, and we do face stark choices. And the question is, which direction will we take? It's a fork in the road that we've seen before. In 1968, our community debated whether to invest in Metro. The John Vihstadts at the time proposed buses up and down Wilson Boulevard instead. Critics said Metro was gold-plated. They said it was an overbuilt extravagance. A decade ago, opponents said the same thing about the Silver Line, that it was too expensive, and proposed more buses instead. Does sound familiar. They were wrong 50 years ago. They were wrong a decade ago. And had they prevailed, we would be a poorer and more congested community today. In fact, under my opponent's approach, we would lose out on billions of dollars in economic growth, thousands of new jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for our schools and social services. Yet he won't say whether he'd raise taxes on residents or reduce services or funding for schools. Let me tell you why I'm running. I'm running because I am impatient for solutions, and I will bring change. I'm frustrated knowing my children will be in overcrowded schools until they graduate, unless we move with greater urgency. I'm ready to roll up our sleeves and do our part to help to solve global warming. I'm impatient with streets that are still too dangerous for adults and for children on foot and on bikes. In fact, I was walk to school with my children this morning with broken link sidewalks and unsafe conditions. I'm impatient to create more housing and better transportation that's affordable. And I have proposed specific plans to address a range of community issues, because my campaign is not about saying no, it is about getting to yes. But even with our challenges, it's clear we have a great community. The desire of people to call Arlington home clearly shows the value of the investments that have created the community that we know today. And we once again face a set of generational decisions that will shape our community for decades. I will uphold the responsibility to carefully steward resources, to drive innovation in all that we do, to make investments in the future of our community. So I ask for your vote on November 4th to move our community forward, so that in 50 years, when others look back and render judgment, they will say, they made the right choices, they were leaders. Thank you very much.
We did pretty good on time. First of all, one more round of applause for the 2 candidates, please. That is not an easy job to be up there. Thank you all, and I will turn it over to Mr. Van Newkirk for some final remarks. We'll get you out. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for coming and invite you to return again a month from now when we talk about the ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft.